MRG has chosen the theme of freedom from hate because each year our colleagues seek to choose an issue of concern to minorities and Indigenous peoples worldwide. And as we follow through our partners and monitor through reports and media, it's very clear to us that hate speech and hate crime are very serious and grave phenomena around the world, and also unfortunately suffer from a certain invisibility due partly to a lack of reporting on the part of most governments, and also, of course, due to the discrimination that minorities and Indigenous peoples face, so that the issues that are of concern to their communities don't get raised and aren't discussed by the wider societies around them. One of the authors of the volume says that hate crime is an act of signaling, of cementing hierarchies. And so therefore hate crimes don't occur in a vacuum. There has to be some kind of notion of status, of supposed superiority and inferiority in the background. In addition, there may be wider societal shifts taking place. For example, a competition around resources or employment that are causing majorities to seek to target and scapegoat minorities as an explanation for what is going on. Migration is a very clear example of that. Finally, we're seeing right now a broader tendency, and that is the impact of the internet and social media that are allowing for unmediated messages to be spread very quickly and to a wide number of people. And we fear that this is simply exacerbating the problem. If hate crimes are an act of signaling supposed superiority and inferiority, the risk is that members of minority communities begin to internalize those messages and begin to feel that they indeed are inferior, and so lack the rights that should enable them to access necessary services, for example, education, health, employment. And all of this creates boundaries and excludes members of minorities and Indigenous peoples. There's a further impact with regard to majorities, that members of majority communities start to accept this otherness as perfectly normal and acceptable. And the problem is that we're talking about a spectrum of instances and actions, and there's a very clear risk that discriminatory speech can lead to hate speech, and hate speech can lead to hate crimes, and a worsening of a situation confronting minorities and Indigenous peoples. In preparing this volume and gathering the documentation, what we found is that hate speech and hate crime truly are worldwide problems. We can start in the Americas. During the past year, there has been considerable debate in the United States concerning racist bullying on university campuses. And this was started by a very grave instance at a university in California, where 4 university students were bullying an African-American roommate by putting up Nazi and Confederate slogans on the walls, and even putting a bicycle lock around his neck. And now these 4 students were suspended and have been charged with hate crimes. But it points to a wider climate of abuse on university campuses, and that has then led to a debate about what responsibility universities have vis-à-vis minority students. Looking to Africa, one of the most severe instances of harm to minority communities has been during the past year or so in the Central African Republic, where the Seleka rebellion led to a backlash from so-called anti-Balaka groups. Initially, this violence wasn't necessarily sectarian in nature, but the rhetoric around the violence became increasingly inflamed, where whole communities were seen to be complicit in the actions being taken by the combatants. And this became worse and worse during the course of the year. Turning to Europe, Roma are particularly vulnerable to hate speech and hate crime, and so we've seen violent attacks against Roma communities in a number of countries. In France, a Molotov cocktail was thrown into a Roma settlement, and this was just the last in a series of attacks against that community. In Hungary as well, there have been violent attacks, there have been incidents of hate speech against Roma there. In Greece, violence broke out in a hospital between supporters of the ultra-right-wing Golden Dawn and Roma community members as they were helping a friend of theirs try to reach the hospital in order to get assistance after a racist attack against him. Looking to Asia, Dalits are particularly vulnerable to hate speech and hate crime and face considerable difficulties in accessing justice. There was an alarming case in Nepal last year of a Dalit woman victim of attempted rape by an upper caste man. And after she tried to report the case to the police, a mob of about 60 people surrounded her and attacked her and covered her in black soot and hung shoes around her neck, both ways of emphasizing her lower caste status. And a Dalit journalist who tried to report on the incident became then abused himself. And most alarmingly in that case, the perpetrators were simply fined for their actions, although we understand that both the woman and the journalist have appealed those sentences. In the Middle East, we can turn our attention to Egypt, where religious minorities have been particularly the target of hate speech and hate crime during recent years. Last year we had the very violent and large-scale incident around the St. Mark's Cathedral in April, where a number of people were killed and over 80 people were injured. And then in August, over 40 churches were attacked, and again a number of people were killed and many were injured. And the case in Egypt highlights an important issue, which is namely that of impunity. The authorities have had a tendency of encouraging victims and perpetrators to gather in so-called reconciliation sessions where they're meant to agree on compensation. Now, of course, the problem with these sessions is that they send a signal to the perpetrators that the criminal justice system doesn't really take their actions very seriously. One key problem is the invisibility that cloaks hate speech and hate crime. The fact of the matter is that members of minorities and indigenous peoples who are victims of hate speech and hate crime may hesitate to turn to the authorities, either because they feel that nothing will be done, that their concerns will not be taken seriously, or because they fear repercussions exactly from the people who should be helping them. So, for instance, there was a study that took place in 4 states in India amongst 500 Dalit women victims of violence, where 40% of the respondents said that they simply didn't bother turning to the authorities for help. So we need, first of all, governments to take the matter seriously and put in place systems in order to collect the data necessary so that we know what's going on. Secondly, governments need to tackle the climate of impunity by passing hate crime legislation and training police and other justice officials to take the matter seriously. With regard to hate speech, it's important for members of majorities to understand that it shouldn't be up to members of minorities to combat hate speech, because minorities are excluded from the media channels that majorities have access to. So it would be simply unfair to put that burden on minorities, although of course very many very brave community leaders do take that role on. So members of majorities must speak out against hate speech and hate crime. And the thing is that they do. There are quite a number of very positive instances where people campaign against hate speech and hate crime, also via the internet. We've seen a number of positive instances where campaigns have spread very quickly via Facebook and Twitter in support of minority communities. We've seen more systematic examples of counter-speech. So, for example, in the Great Lakes region, in several countries, there are now radio stations that broadcast a number of different kinds of programs, including debate shows, soap operas, with a very inclusive message in order to combat messages of hate. Furthermore, there have been examples of so-called exit programs in several European countries where support has been provided to former members of neo-Nazi groups and helping them to get back into mainstream society. That's a very particular and targeted approach, but it has had some success in a number of countries. Staying with Europe, we should turn to the United Kingdom, where an organization called Tell Mama has established a telephone hotline. And it reported last year that during its first 12 months of operation, it had received over 630 calls from members of the Muslim community reporting instances of hate speech and hate crime. The majority of those calling in were Muslim women, and the vast majority, 75% of the perpetrators, were men. And I think this example underscores the gendered aspect of hate speech and hate crime, where perpetrators see minority and indigenous women as somehow the most visible examples, of the minorities that they wish to target. And so minority and Indigenous women become particularly vulnerable to hate speech and hate crimes. One of the things that we at MRG want to underscore is that people in general have a very important role to play in combating hate speech and hate crime. For instance, I myself was very moved the days after the Anders Breivik massacre in Norway, when tens of thousands of people crowded the streets of Oslo to say that that man's message of hate and violence was unacceptable to them. So that shows the power of mobilization and mass action, and the possibility that everyone can get engaged in fighting hate crime and hate speech.